The knife went in clean, too clean, not the desperate strike of an enemy, not the chaotic blow of war, but something precise, measured, intentional, and yet the king didn't fall. For a moment, nothing happened. No gasp, no scream, no reaction from the soldiers around them, because no one saw it, no one expected it, no one would ever believe it, even if they did, because the man holding the blade was General Valor, the king's closest ally. The king exhaled slowly, not from pain, from realization. Ah! That was all he said. Not why, not how. Just ah, as if something he had been waiting for had finally arrived. Valor didn't pull the knife out. He didn't push it deeper either. He simply held it there, between them, like a secret. The battlefield roared around them, steel clashing, men shouting, horses collapsing. But in that moment, it didn't exist. There was only the king and the man who had just betrayed him. "You took your time," the king said quietly. That was the first crack, because that were not the reaction of a man betrayed. That was the reaction of a man who expected it. Valor's eyes narrowed, just slightly, just enough. "You knew?" he asked. The king smiled, not wide, not proud, just knowing. "I suspected," he said. A pause. Then he leaned slightly closer to the blade, closer to Valor, but I didn't know when. That's when something shifted, not on the battlefield, not in the army, but in Valor, because betrayal is powerful, but not when it's expected. "You're not surprised," Valor said. "No," the king replied calmly. And then something even stranger happened. The king took a step forward into the blade, not enough to kill him, but enough to make one thing clear: he wasn't afraid. "I've been waiting for you to make a mistake," the king said. That sentence changed everything, because suddenly the betrayal didn't feel like victory. It felt like exposure. Valor pulled the blade out quickly, not in panic, but in recalculation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The king stepped back, blood slowly spreading across his side, but his posture still unbroken. "You always stood too close," the king continued. A strange observation, out of place, out of moment. Valor frowned. "What?" The king tilted his head slightly, watching him, studying him. "You were always close enough to kill me." A pause. "But you never did." Silence. "And that," the king said softly, "is what made you dangerous." For the first time, Valor didn't respond immediately, because that was true. He had been close for years, in rooms with no guards, on hunts with no witnesses, in battles where chaos covered everything. And yet, he never struck. Not until now. And now, the king was telling him that delay had exposed him. "You hesitated," the king said. Valor shook his head. "No!" But the denial came too fast, too sharp. The king smiled slightly. "You didn't hesitate because you were afraid," he said, a step closer. "You hesitated because this was never just about killing me." That line was a blade sharper than steel, because it hit something deeper. Valor's grip tightened around the knife. "Then what is it about?" he asked. Finally. A question. And that was exactly what the king wanted, because questions mean uncertainty, and uncertainty means control is shifting. The king didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Valor at the battlefield, and that's when something else became clear. The army wasn't collapsing. It was splitting. Orders weren't being followed, because different men were following different commands. Some units were pulling back, others advancing, some turning on each other. It looked like chaos, but it wasn't. It was design. Valor noticed it too. His eyes scanned the field, fast, sharp, calculating. This wasn't part of his plan, which meant the king had a plan. "You're not the only one who prepares," the king said quietly. Vailor turned back to him. "You're bleeding," he said. The king glanced down. "Not enough." Then back up. "Not yet." A strange response, because most men would be focused on survival. But the king was focused on something else, something bigger. "You let this happen," Vailor said. Not a question, a realization. The king didn't deny it. "I needed to see it," he said. "See what?" The king's eyes locked onto his. "How far you'd go." Silence. Then Vailor laughed, not loudly, not mockingly, just once. A short, sharp exhale. "You think this is about you?" he said, and that was the second crack. Because now the story had shifted. This wasn't just betrayal, there was something else. Something bigger than the king. Something Vailor had been building toward for years. And the king still didn't fully understand it. Good. Because neither did the audience, and that's what keeps them watching. Vailor stepped back, creating distance now, not closeness, because the moment had changed. "I didn't wait all these years just to kill you," he said. The king raised an eyebrow slightly. "I assumed as much." Another step back. "I needed you alive," Vailor continued. That line shouldn't make sense, but it did, because if the king died too early, the plan wouldn't work. But what plan? That question hung in the air, unanswered, uncomfortable, necessary. The king finally asked it. "What are you really after?" Vailor smiled for the first time, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't proud. It was quiet, controlled, like a man who had already won, just waiting for the moment everyone else realizes it. "You'll see," he said. The battlefield didn't sound the same anymore. Not because the fighting had stopped, but because it no longer made sense. Commands overlapped, units moved against orders, signals contradicted each other, and in the centre of it all, the king stood bleeding, and General Vailor stood watching. But now, they weren't enemies in a fight. They were two men trying to understand who had already won. "You said I'd see," the king said quietly. Vailor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his back. That alone was dangerous. Because no one turns their back on a wounded king unless they're absolutely certain the king is no longer the threat. "You always believed this kingdom was yours," Vailor said, facing the chaos ahead. The king let out a slow breath. "It is." Vailor shook his head. "No," he said. A pause. "You were allowed to hold it." That line didn't land like an insult. It landed like a correction. And for the first time, the king didn't immediately respond, because something in that sentence didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like truth. "Explain," the king said. Vailor finally turned back. "You think I betrayed you today," he said. A step closer. "But this," he gestured toward the battlefield, "this started long before you ever wore that crown." Now the ground beneath the story begins to shift, because if the betrayal didn't start with Vailor, then where did it start? "You're speaking in riddles," the king said. "No," Vailor replied calmly. "I'm speaking in pieces." And that's exactly what this is, a puzzle. Vailor walked past him slowly, not circling, not threatening, just moving. "I spent years beside you," he continued, "not watching you rule." A pause. Watching what you were ruling. That difference was everything. The king frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Vailor stopped. "You never noticed it," he said. A quiet disappointment in his voice. Or maybe, he tilted his head slightly, "you chose not to." Now we introduce doubt, because doubt destroys certainty. "Say it clearly," the king demanded. Vailor looked at him, really looked at him. And then he asked a question instead. Do you remember the eastern villages? The king blinked. A strange question. Of course, he said. They were rebuilt after the fire. Vailor's expression didn't change. Yes, he said. They were. A pause. Do you remember who ordered that fire? Silence. Not long, but enough. The king's eyes narrowed slightly. It was a rebellion, he said. The villages were sheltering traitors. Vailor stepped closer again. And who told you that? That question hit differently, because kings don't question information. They act on it. But now, the foundation of those actions was being challenged. The council confirmed it, the king said. Vailor nodded slowly. Yes, he said, they did. A step closer. And you trusted them. There it is again. Trust. Always trust. The king's voice hardened slightly. They had no reason to lie. Vailor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his armour. Slow. Deliberate, not for a weapon, for something else. A folded piece of parchment. Old. Worn. He held it out. The king hesitated. Not out of fear, but instinct. Just because something about this moment felt heavier than the knife. He took it, unfolded it, and read. At first, nothing changed. Then everything did. His eyes slowed, his breathing shifted, and the battlefield faded again because the words on that parchment didn't accuse him. They exposed something far worse. Where did you get this? The king asked quietly. Vailor didn't answer, because the answer didn't matter. The truth did. That fire, the king said slowly, was ordered before the rebellion. Not after. Not in response. Before, which means it wasn't defence. It was control. And the rebellion was a reaction, not a cause. The king looked up. And for the first time, there was something in his eyes we hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, but doubt. Real doubt. You're lying, he said. But it didn't sound like certainty. It sounded like resistance. Vailor stepped closer. I thought so too, he said. A pause. At first. And now the story expands. Because this isn't just about betrayal anymore. This is about truth. Hidden truth, buried truth, weaponized truth. I spent years verifying it, Vailor continued. Every record, every order, every report, another step. And every time, a beat. The truth pointed to the same place. The king didn't speak, because he already knew what Vailor was about to say, but he didn't want to hear it. The throne, Vailor said. Silence, heavy, unavoidable, because now the betrayal has flipped. The king is no longer just a victim. He might be part of something worse. That's impossible, the king said. Vailor shook his head. No, he said. It's hidden. A crucial distinction, because impossible means it can't exist. Hidden means it already does. You think I built this plan to take your throne? Vailor asked. The king didn't respond, because now he wasn't sure. I didn't, Vailor said. A pause. I built it to expose what sits on it. That line changes the entire story, because now we're not asking, why did he betray the king? We're asking, what is the king really sitting on? And that question is far more dangerous. The king looked at him, long, hard. You're either the greatest liar I've ever seen, he said slowly, or I've been blind my entire reign. Vailor didn't smile. Both can be true, he said. And just like that, the certainty is gone, replaced with something worse. Possibility. And before the king can respond, something shifts on the battlefield, a signal, subtle but deliberate. Vailor sees it first. Then he smiles, not at the king, past him. At last, he said quietly. The king turned, And what he saw didn't make sense. Not yet, but it will. The signal came from the western ridge. One short blast, then another, low, heavy, not the sound of retreat, not the sound of victory. Something else, something older, something the king had not heard in years. He turned toward it instinctively, blood still warm at his side, sword hanging low in his grip. And for the first time since the knife entered him, his face truly changed. Because across the ridge, through the smoke and the wavering banners, a new line of soldiers was emerging, not his, not the enemy's. And yet, they moved like men who belonged here. Their formation was too disciplined to be mercenaries, too deliberate to be reinforcements arriving by chance. And at their centre, a single black standard lifted into the wind. No crest, no lion, no crown, just a plain field of black cloth marked by one silver circle. The king's breathing slowed, not from pain, from memory. "No," he said. So quietly the word almost vanished in the noise. Vailor heard it. Of course he did. That was the point. He turned, watching the king instead of the incoming force. Not to see whether he understood, but to see how long it would take him to admit it. The king's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on that banner as though looking at a ghost. That standard was destroyed, he said. Vailor's voice was calm. "No," he replied, "or it was hidden." And there it was again. Not impossible. Hidden. The difference between those two words now felt larger than war itself. The black-bannered soldiers moved down the ridge in silence, not rushing, not charging. They were not here to rescue. They were not here to conquer. They were here for a moment, a reckoning, a return. The king turned slowly toward Vailor. "You brought them here." Vailor gave the smallest nod. "I promised them a door," he said. "You were the one who opened it." Another line that struck deeper than a blade, because that meant the king's own choices, his orders, his campaigns, his trust, his certainty had led to this. The king looked back across the field. His soldiers were no longer simply fighting. They were watching too, confused by the new arrival. Confused by the hesitation spreading through every rank, because battles survive on certainty, and certainty had just died. "Who are they?" the king asked, but his voice betrayed him, because he already knew. He just needed Vailor to say it aloud, needed the words to wound him completely. Vailor stepped beside him, not behind, not before, beside. Like an equal who had waited long enough to stop pretending otherwise. "They are the last sworn men of the first circle," he said. The king shut his eyes for one brief moment. That name had not been spoken openly in court for almost 20 years. Most believed it was a myth, a dead faction, a ceremonial lie buried with the old dynasty. But the old truths never die cleanly. They rot beneath the stone. They whisper through records. They survive in the blood of men who remember. "The first circle was dissolved," the king said, still not looking at him. Vailor's answer came without hesitation. "No," he said again, "it was betrayed." The battlefield seemed farther away now, smaller. The world had narrowed into a place where only truth mattered. And truth had become unbearable. The black standard came closer. The silver ring at its centre glimmered once in the smoke-filtered sun, and as it did, a memory surfaced in the king's mind with brutal clarity. A corridor of cold marble, a locked chamber, an old man kneeling, his father standing over him, not angry, not uncertain, decisive, always decisive. The old man had worn a ring, silver, plain, marked with a circle, the same mark now moving across the field. The king opened his eyes, slowly. And the worst part was not that he remembered. The worst part was that he remembered choosing to forget. "You knew," Violor said softly. It was not an accusation, it was worse. It was understanding. The king's voice came rougher now. "I knew fragments." Violor looked at him. "And you never asked why the fragments were all that remained." The king turned sharply, because asking would have meant tearing apart the throne itself. There, finally. Truth, not clean truth, not noble truth, but human truth. The kind men bury because it keeps the roof from collapsing. Violor did not flinch. "Yes," he said, "that was the point." The black-bannered force stopped within shouting distance. At their head rode a woman in dark armour, with no ornament except a silver clasp at her throat. No crown, no royal silk, no visible ambition. And yet the way she sat her horse made it obvious. This was a person who had never needed to demand obedience. She had been born expecting it. The king stared at her. Longer than he should have, because her face struck him not like surprise, but recognition delayed by years. There was something in the line of her jaw, something in her eyes, something that echoed portraits locked in royal vaults no servant was permitted to clean. Violor watched that realization move through him. Good, let it hurt in layers. The woman dismounted, walked forward a few measured steps, then stopped. She looked not at Violor, but directly at the king. "You've worn our house's silence well," she said. Her voice carried across the field without effort, not loud, just certain. The king's fingers tightened around his sword. "Who are you?" But even now it sounded weaker than the question should have, as if some part of him was pleading for the answer not to come. The woman tilted her head slightly, a gesture almost elegant enough to be cruel. "I am Ceres," she said, "daughter of Alaric." The name hit him harder than the knife had, because Alaric was not supposed to have a daughter. Officially, Alaric had died without issue when the first circle fell. That was the story. That was the clean ending. That was the lie. "No," the king said again, but this time the word had no force, only habit. Ceres held his gaze. "Your father burned my house," she said. "He burned the records, the heirs, the names, the vows." A beat, and he almost succeeded. The king looked at Violor, then back at Ceres. Then, slowly, understanding began to reassemble the entire war around him. The eastern villages, the falsified reports, the hidden documents, Violor's years of patience, the knife that did not kill, the ambush that was not an ambush. None of this had been built merely to take a throne. It had been built to make a throne answer for itself. "You're claiming the crown," the king said. Ceres's expression did not change. "That's what your father would have done," she replied. A pause. "I'm claiming the truth." That answer landed strangely, because it did not sound like hunger. It sounded like judgment, and that made it more dangerous. Around them, the soldiers on both sides had gone nearly still. Men who had expected to die for one king were now listening to history rise out of the dust and correct itself. The king looked at Violor. "All this time," he said quietly, "you weren't serving me." Violor met his eyes. "No," he said, "I was measuring you." That line cut deeper than anything else, because betrayal by hatred is simple. Betrayal by evaluation. That means every smile, every oath, every victory, every council meeting had been something colder. A test. "And what was the judgment?" the king asked. Violor did not answer right away. For the first time since the knife, there was something almost like weariness in him. Not regret, not mercy, just the exhaustion of a man who had carried a truth too long. "You were not your father," he said at last. The king's eyes flickered. That almost sounded like absolution, almost. Then Vailor finished. But you were too willing to live on what he stole. And there it was, the final condemnation. Not monster, not tyrant. Something more human and harder to escape. A man who knew enough to question and chose comfort instead. The king looked down at the blood on his hand, at the field around him, at the soldiers who had trusted his banner because he had trusted the story beneath it. Everything felt suddenly borrowed, even his name. "What happens now?" he asked. Cerys answered, "That depends on whether you want to die as a king." She took one step forward, or live as a witness. A beautiful line, a dangerous line, because it offered him something men like him fear more than death, survival without illusion. The king gave a tired half laugh. "You planned this well." Cerys' gaze did not soften. "No," she said. "Vailor planned the door. You planned the rest each time you chose silence." Even now they refused to let him escape responsibility. Good. That gave the ending weight. The king turned toward Vailor one last time. "Why the knife?" he asked. "If this was a revelation, why not simply expose me in court?" Vailor's answer came low. "Because courts serve thrones." A beat. Pain serves truth. The king absorbed that, and somewhere inside him, the last shield gave way, because he knew it was true. A speech in court would have become argument. Documents would have become accusations. Counsellors would have protected their places. But blood on a battlefield, with armies watching and history cornered, that could not be buried so easily. The king looked at Cerys, then at his own soldiers. Many still held formation. Many were confused. Many were waiting for a command. A single word from him could still restart the battle. Thousands would die. Maybe Cerys would fall. Maybe Vailor too. And perhaps through sheer force, the throne would survive another generation on top of its lie. He could do it. That was the terrible thing. He could still choose power. Vailor saw the choice passing through him. His hand tightened on the knife. Not threatening, ready. If the king reached for war again, this time the blade would finish what it started. For several long seconds no one moved. That was the real climax. Not steel, not shouting. Choice. Then the king dropped his sword. It hit the ground, with a sound far smaller than expected. But everyone heard it. A murmur passed through the field, like wind through dry grass. The king straightened, despite the blood loss, looked at Cerys, then at Vailor, and when he spoke, his voice carried more honestly than it ever had from the throne. "My father stole what he could not inherit," he said. The words were slow, deliberate. He erased what threatened him and called it order. A breath. "And his eyes moved across the watching soldiers. "I protected the comfort of that lie because I mistook inheritance for legitimacy." No one interrupted. No one dared. The king went on. "The crown I wore was real enough to command men." A beat. "But not real enough to absolve me." Cerys watched him carefully, not impressed, not softened, just listening for whether he would stop at confession or continue into consequence. He did continue. Good. He turned toward his army. "Stand down." This time the command travelled instantly, no confusion, no split loyalties, because clarity had finally returned. Not political clarity, moral clarity, the kind men obey even when they do not like it. Shields lowered, blades dipped, the field exhaled. Then he faced Cerys again. "If there are surviving records, witnesses, oaths, blood claims, bring them before the realm." A pause. Let the throne answer in daylight. Cerys held his gaze. And if the realm names me rightful heir... The king looked at the fallen sword near his feet, then back up. Then it will be the first honest crowning this land has seen in my lifetime. A powerful line, but it needed a scar. So Vaelor stepped in, not to ruin it, to complete it. And if the realm names you necessary, Vaelor asked. The king frowned slightly. Vaelor's eyes were steady. You think surrender cleanses you, he said. It doesn't, a beat. It only begins the cost. Yes, that is the right pressure, because redemption without cost feels cheap. The king nodded once, slowly. I know. And for the first time, it sounded like he truly did. Cerys looked between the two men, one who had carried the lie, one who had carved it open. Then she said the one thing neither of them expected. The realm will judge the throne, she said, but I will judge the knife. Both men looked at her. She turned to Vaelor. You did what had to be done, she said. A pause. Then you decided pain was your right to choose. Vaelor's face stilled, because that struck somewhere even truth had not touched yet. You served the cause, Cerys continued. But somewhere in those years her gaze sharpened, so you began to enjoy becoming the blade. Now that is layered, because the betrayer is not left pure. Justice has teeth, and teeth mark the mouth that bears them. Vaelor said nothing. For the first time, his silence did not feel like control. It felt like exposure. Cerys looked at the king, then back to Vaelor. One built his life on a stolen inheritance, she said. The other built his purpose on a wound. A beat, and both mistook that for righteousness. No one on that field would forget those words, because they condemned both power and vengeance in the same breath. And that made the ending larger than politics. It made it human. The king swayed slightly. The blood loss was catching him now. One of his captains instinctively stepped forward, but the king raised a hand to stop him. He kept his eyes on Vaelor. Did you ever mean any of it? He asked quietly. This was not about the throne anymore. This was personal. Painfully personal. The last question left between two men who had stood beside each other for years. Vaelor looked at him for a long time, long enough that the answer mattered. Then he said, yes. The king's brow tightened. Vaelor continued. The loyalty was real. A pause. And that was the worst part. There. That is the line the whole story had been reaching for. Because pure deception is easy to understand. Mixed truth? That haunts. I hated what you sat on, Vaelor said, but not always the man sitting there. His voice lowered. And that is why I waited too long. The king closed his eyes for one brief second. Not because it absolved anything, but because somehow it hurt more. Cerys turned to her soldiers. Take the records, she ordered. Secure the wounded. Disarm the dead lines. No looting. No reprisals. That told everyone what kind of ruler she might be. Not triumphant, disciplined, already thinking beyond revenge. Good. Then she faced the king again. You will live, she said, long enough to testify, and to Vaelor, you will live too. A beat, long enough to answer for the shape your justice took. Neither man protested, because they both understood survival had become sentence. The black standard rose higher over the field as medics and soldiers began to move, not like victors, like witnesses rearranging the stage after truth had shattered the play. The king looked out across the land he had ruled. It was still there, the hills, the smoke, the men, the banners. But nothing in it belonged to the story he had told himself anymore. Vaelor stood a few paces away, knife lowered now, and for the first time in years he looked less like a general than a man stripped of the only purpose that had kept him standing. And between them, walking forward into the space history had withheld from her, came Ceres, not crowned, not anointed, not acclaimed, but undeniable. Because some people do not arrive to seize power. They arrive because the lie can no longer hold without them. Final line. The king thought the knife was the betrayal. It wasn't. The real betrayal was older, quieter, and far more dangerous, and the moment truth was buried, and powerful men decided they could live comfortably above it.